Welcome to episode 6 of the International Web Effectiveness Podcast, where Bill Hunt and I, Bill Scully, focus on the strategies and techniques necessary to improve your web presence and manage global websites. In our last episode, we discussed the root causes of web project failures. In this episode, we're going to go deep into a review of the recent Google Search Off the Record podcast that discussed website internationalization and HREFLang. Hey, Bill. You wrote a pretty in-depth review of the Search Off the Record podcast. This must have taken you a long time to write. I think it actually took me longer to read your post than it did to listen to the podcast. But you had some great observations here, and I didn't want them to go unnoticed. So why don't you give us an explanation why you wrote it and let us know what's in it.
I did it. It was probably a lot more to read than it could have been. And the reason I dug deeper into it, one, because there was some fascinating insights and nuggets in there. I wanted to try to tease those out because none of the mainstream sort of, industry media sources really even mentioned them. They took a couple of the clickbaitish topics that, Google's going to automate or could automate HREFLang and eliminate it. That's not necessarily what they said. And then the second one was because people were reading those articles and sending me questions. And so in order to write back to them, I really wanted to make sure that I heard what was said. I read the transcript. I listened to it multiple times. And then I had to write, obviously, to these clients or to former clients to answer these questions. And it was a couple of interesting things that I teased out from it. And one, I think that my favorite quote, which I put in the article, was Gary saying that, the language itself of a page is not a tell for what country you're targeting. And we've talked about that before, when I think in episode 1, where we were talking about some of the frustrations of SEOs, one of the things we mentioned is a lot of people really don't understand what HREFLang does. And I've tried to get people to understand that it's both telling people the language, yes, but more importantly, what market is that language for? And I often give the example of Nike with 78 websites. I think 38 or 37 are in English, and 22 of them have a dollar symbol. And Gary mentions this. If you think about Google encountering all 38 of these in English, and Martin says, well, yeah, the only thing that for a lot of sites I see that's different might be currency, whether it has a VAT tax, maybe there's a different size. He even referenced shipping. And that was an interesting conversation when they're like, well, shipping is usually further down the chain. But that was the thing that they really tried to get people to understand, that it's actually fairly hard to understand the market. And the market is what helps you differentiate it. So I thought that was great that he called that out in very simplistic terms, that it doesn't tell them the market. I think the second thing was that I took away is Gary specifically mentioned that a crawling dependency is triggered when Google encounters hreflang. And what he meant by that is that if Google encounters a page, it's got hreflang tags or in the header or in an XML sitemap, that triggers Google to want to validate that. And through that validation process, they want to go fetch those pages. So the implications of this are huge. Imagine if you launch a new market, that's going to help accelerate the indexing of that through this. It's interesting. A couple people were chatting about their latest event where they were talking about crawling, and there are people that still don't think XML sitemaps do anything for Google.
Mhm.
But we see this, like, especially for site migrations, when we implement HREFLang, how important that is. And that helps Google rip through those alternate pages pretty quickly. And then the last one I want to talk about is this idea of automation. So it came in when, Martin had said, well, why don't we use the HTML language tag? It's in the header of every page. It's a W3C requirement to state the language or country. And Gary gave examples that, well, very few are actually correct. And he actually described Joomla back in the day. If you deploy Joomla, no matter what market you put it in, there was no way to override the hardwired setting of US English in Joomla. There was no way to change that. And we see that a lot. It's actually, if you have a French development firm install WordPress for you, 9 times out of 10, your US English page will have FRFR tags because that's the code pack that they installed. So it's an interesting thing that things are native to where you downloaded the code pack from. And so they said because of that, they can't use that as a signal. And then they got into an interesting discussion. Well, if people are, like Gary even said, we should be able to trust in enterprise HREFLang because the investment to install that is pretty high. The amount of effort for an enterprise to do it. And I thought that was sort of hilarious because most people half-ass that. And so
Unless you do it right.
some do it right.
No, I said unless you do it right, then you're not
Exactly.
doing it half-ass. Yeah.
But that's his point, that if companies are investing the resources to do it, why aren't they doing it correct? Anyways, at the end of the day, he said, we used to be able to detect a lot of this 10 years ago when he was first working on HREFLang. And he said, with all the AI and all the intelligence we have now, we should be able to do this relatively easy. He didn't give how they might do it, but in his mind, he thought that they might be able to automate this, which if they could, I think we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we have for people that have either incorrect or aren't using HREFLang. But it was an interesting piece. And then the only other piece I want people to look at is there was a couple things in here about language demotion, country promotion. This is a piggyback on I think we've had this discussion twice now about CCTLD or country level domains, that the commercialization of them, like now the .ai has been bastardized or commercialized for AI projects, just like Colombia was and TV was. So those countries basically sold the rights, forego them being country language and making them, global top level domain or generic top level domains.
Hey, this is Bill Scully. We hope you're enjoying our conversations as much as we love bringing them to you. If you like what you hear, we would really appreciate it if you could take a moment and rate our podcast. Your ratings help us reach more listeners and keep the show going. Just head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts and give us a 5-star rating. Let us know what you think in a review section. It only takes a few seconds, but it makes a huge difference for us. Plus, we love hearing your feedback. Thanks so much for your support.
So that was one. And then one other one, it's pretty geeky, but where Google uses a thing called attribute grammar language, where basically the language of the query, the context of that language would serve a result that matches, but then you throw in some personalization, and somebody doing an English language query, like they said, how do you spell banana?
Right.
That was an English query for, I guess, I don't know, maybe it is an English word. Or a global word for banana, but they said in a couple cases they were getting like German results, and that's because they had a language preference set to German, and it was a battle between, do we serve it based on a query, do we serve it based on the best result that matches the query language, and then do we throw in a flavor of personalization? So that further gums up the works on how do you get your stuff there. But it's a fairly long article, as you mentioned, but I tried to go through all of these and explain them for people that may have never heard these concepts before.
The new one for me was the language demotion country promotion algorithm. I had never heard of that before. Makes a lot of sense. And I think that, I see people even creating HREFLang and using English in the wrong countries with the wrong language. So let's say 80% of your pages are French. So you have FRFR, but 20% are in English. Is this where this algorithm comes into play?
Exactly. And the example they gave was Martin created a site, and it was on a .de, 100% English, about coding. And so what Gary was trying to describe was that if somebody in Germany That site would get a promotion because it's a .de, it's a Germany website, but it could potentially get a demotion based on the query because it's in English. And exactly that. And we actually call this concept you just described, where a percentage, large or small, are in a language other than what you're listing in your HREFLang. And we called this aspirational HREFLang. And I reference it in here, and I give both sides of the equation. Is it aspirational, meaning your developers got ahead of themselves, or they only have the ability to set one language country combo? You set it in one example I gave was French, where, it was 80% French. And then there was, 20% that hadn't been localized, but it was still English and set to French. Google knows that. Now, we actually show in the article, and then we link to a much bigger case where a company had hired a content generation company that spun out 100,000 pages, all these definitions, and they set them all. They were all in English, but they were using HREFLang Builder, which, because we had been told everything in Greece and Czech and Netherlands, Romania, it was like 20 markets were 100% localized when they weren't. And in the article, I have a chart where 90%, in some cases, all but 2 or 3 had been kicked out. Google had said, didn't even want to index them because they misled them, maybe, that they said they were in Greek, but they were actually in English. And what was interesting is all of these markets where they did that, they had the incorrect language, they were all flagged as duplicate and basically not indexed. When we changed it in HREFLang, we actually created a separate XML for all of these articles. We set the language correctly, and within like 2 weeks, Google started re-indexing again because now they had the correct language. So we still said it's for Greece, but now it's in English. And so we didn't mislead Google as to the language. And so we think that, that algorithm kicked in saying, yeah, these are in English. And so we'll re-index them because we weren't misleading either on accident or on purpose.
Another great conversation. So we'll call this a wrap. Hey, this is Bill Scully. I just wanted to let you know that we have a free training course called Demystifying HREFLang. It includes 6 modules and is over an hour long with a quiz at the end of each module. You can find it at internationalwebmastery.com. Hope to see you there. Before we sign off, though, I want to remind people that we have a free public Facebook group. Just search for International Web Mastery Public. You can also find a link to it in the show notes. Because it's a group, you're not going to be spamming your friends with group conversations, so we'd love it if you could contribute to our conversations. You can ask us any questions, and we'll be there to answer them. We look forward to any type of feedback you have. Feedback gives us good information for future episodes, as well as making improvements and providing more value. And in our next episode, we're going to be discussing creative project budgeting. So we hope you'll be able to join us. See you then. Bye.